interesting thing, actually. The only thing that sort of caught my attention about Biden, I should be, pretty open that I sort of end up frustrating both sides in this conversation because I don't look. You got to get Donald Trump out of office. I'm sorry, that's not that hard to figure out. I completely think you should, if you're in a competitive state, you should vote for Joe Biden. That's out of the way. I think clearly, there's some left momentum in some ways, but I'm sort of not. I mean, I think the conditions are there where, we're in a pandemic, over 5 million people just lost their private health insurance. Like the obvious answers of things like single payer, which were already there if you were paying attention, are getting more apparent by the day. The actual power structure, the interests that run the Democratic Party and so on, I don't see the shift. I mean, I in no way undercutting the amazing work that Sanders has done. But this one thing that I found sort of interesting was I was listening to a conversation with this author, David Paul Kuhn, and he has a new book out. I think it's called the Hard Hat Rebellion. It's the day the white working class turned Republican, and it's about basically in 1970 in New York when these hard hat guys went and beat up some Vietnam protesters.
I remember it well.
Yeah, were you there?
I wasn't there, but I was alive and
actually
conscious. They've got a lot of press coverage.
Yeah, and so this guy is definitely, I would say, he's kind of a, I don't know if I had to place him ideologically, he's kind of a, he's a younger guy, but he's still sort of like a lunch pail Democrat. That's his thing. And, he doesn't support Trump, but he's definitely somebody who's going to have, certainly relative to most media, a lot more interest in the motivations of the Trump base. And there's some areas, obviously, I disagree with, but the thing that I thought was interesting was that he frames what was going on in terms of the process of class differentiation in the Democratic Party, and that basically, yes, these guys, as an example, they rioted, they were thuggish, they beat the shit out of these protesters. It was horrible. And of course, I'm not sure his position, but obviously the protesters were right about the genocide in Vietnam. But his sort of, his other sort of argument is that what wasn't being attended to here was that, basically these guys were getting shafted. They were about to, the deindustrialization was starting. The new wave of the new left, in ways that echo today, had nothing for them other than to just sort of, condemn and blame them and, look down on them from the kind of perspective of education and social capital. And it's funny because he's probably one of the only writers in America who's very interested in Biden, because he kind of thinks that Biden is somebody who can sort of bridge to this group. And again, going to the Greenberg polling, I mean, he's showing, there are elements of the Trump base that are leaving, particularly white working class women. And so I'm curious, not to again, it's evident that a lot of the voting base of the Republican Party is doing white identitarian politics, and they responded to the vicious racism and xenophobia. And then there's this other atmospherics of, there's the economic dimension, and then there's also this feeling alienated from social power dimension, which I think is increasingly going to spill out. It's not just going to be a quote unquote white working class thing. It's going to be educated versus uneducated, and probably pretty geographically and class based. And I'm wondering, how did Bernie, what was the good ways that Bernie approached that? And is there anything in Biden that is interesting about that? Or is it just sort of his, because I'm reading Kuhn and I'm just thinking to myself, yeah, Biden says he's from Scranton all the time. Who cares? So what?
Well, let me add one point to what Kuhn was arguing and talking about, because this was, historians are finally looking at the 70s really seriously. There's some great books that have come out in the last 5 years on sort of the changeover of our politics in the 70s towards the sort of neoliberal era that followed the end of the 60s. And on one hand, there was the sort of hard hat, white working class sort of anger that moved them politically to the right. At the same time, and I'd argue probably every bit as important, there was a strong movement of young workers that was to the left, especially workers coming back from Vietnam who had done time there and who'd been politicized there. So, the great story in American factories in the early 1970s was the Lordstown factory in Youngstown, Ohio, the great automobile plant, the most modern, largest in the world, where the workers did a wildcat strike, and it was a left-wing strike against working conditions. And it was, working class people, most of them vets, multiracial, and it was, and the Democratic Party had no place for them. They didn't have
in either direction,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Because
right.
they're the old, it's too radical and multiracial for some of the kind of old, but then the new stuff is just college suburban.
When we conceive of the white working class as just these sort of like Archie Bunker types with hard hats, it does a great injustice to what was going on the ground there. It's a multicultural working class movement, especially coming out of the Vietnam vets. So just wanted to toss that in there so people don't think that.
That's great.
I know you don't, but just people wouldn't think you take it for granted. That's how white working class people are as a whole. I think what Bernie did was the thing that all leftists have always done why they're working class candidates. You guarantee a job at a living wage. You guarantee the rights to unions. You have mass enfranchisement. You guarantee housing. Bernie built his campaign around FDR's Second Bill of Rights, which is basically the manifesto of social democracy or democratic socialism. I mean, Olof Palme, the great Swedish social democrat, probably the greatest social democrat of the 20th century, went to college in Ohio in the 1940s. And he was a conservative when he came to America. Then he saw the racism in America, and he became a radical, went back to become a socialist. But much of their social democracy is patterned after FDR's Second Bill of Rights, and that's true across Europe. And that's what Bernie's whole campaign was built on. And that basically says, doesn't pit people against each other. It says we all have class solidarity. We all benefit if everyone has a job, if we have housing, if we have high wages. That's the world we should build, a harmonious world. And we should eliminate the power of the wealthy to run the government and to run our lives. And if you don't do that, you have a lot of trouble. If you're just going to get into dealing with people's grievances, well, you aren't going to win that fight. The people who specialize in grievance manufacturing are going to win that. And Trump is the greatest grievance manufacturer we've ever seen.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.